Hello again. I am really tickled, pleased, and proud to introduce our guest today, Governor Scott Walker. He comes to you as president of the Young Americans Foundation. We keep referring to it as YAF, and some of you may have wondered, what is YAF? Well, it's Young America's Foundation. Scott Walker was a great young American himself, participating in school sports, scouting, church activities, Boys Nation, and Boys State when growing up. He attended Marquette University and succumbed to the lure of Republican politics. He was first elected to the Wisconsin State Assembly in 1992. Happily, he found time to wed Tonette in 1993. He won the race for governor in 2010, and even with fierce opposition from the Democrats, he won a record recall in 2012. For 8 years, he served as a very popular governor, championing right-to-life causes, right-to-work laws, among others. Did I tell you he rides a Harley, too? YAF proudly installed the governor as their president in 2021. Since then, he's been overseeing 500 YAF chapters and preservation of Ronald Reagan's beloved ranch in California. Tonette, for her part, serves on the board for the ranch and is the mother of their 2 sons. YAF has been inspired by the vision and principles of Ronald Reagan, looking to educate America's youth with conservative ideals and principles. Governor Walker.
Well, good afternoon. It is great to see such a lovely crowd and so much red. I love to see all this red. Not only Republican red, but coming from the Badger State, we have red there too, so it's a double winner for us. But 2024, welcome to 2024, right? It is going to be an incredible year. It is really the next election coming up this fall is probably going to be one of the defining elections. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I also want to talk in a moment as well about how equally, if not more important than just that next election, is the next generation and what we need to do to address that. But first, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for all of you being here today. As Darlene mentioned, I was governor, and before that actually was elected the Milwaukee County Executive. Milwaukee County is the largest county in Wisconsin. It is a blue county. The year I was reelected, Barack Obama won with over 2/3 of the vote. I won with 60% of the vote. We took on a big scandal there, and I got to tell you, though, the reason I say it to this group is I could not have won without Republican women. So I know that you have helped made Florida a deep, deep red state, and it wouldn't happen without Republican women, so thank you. I very much appreciate that on behalf of all of us in the country, not just here in Florida. So thank you for that. Thank you as well. She mentioned this in her introduction. In 2012, I won a recall election, the very first governor in American history to do that. The reason we had a recall, you remember at the time, is I did something unusual in politics, at least in a blue state like Wisconsin. I actually did what I said I was going to do, right? So they tried to recall me over that. We came in within the first few days, Roy, you know this, taking office. We took office and we did the things we said, and particularly the unions. I always stress the union bosses, because when we think about public servants, there's a lot of good public servants in our country at the state and the local level as well. There's great teachers out there, and there's teachers union bosses that aren't so great. And they didn't like what we did, because we took the power out of their hands and put it firmly into the hands of the hardworking people and the people they elect to duly run their offices, be it the school board, the city council, the county board, or what have you. And so they sent initially, the first couple days it was a few thousand. About a weekend, the national union bosses and their lawyers figured out that there was this never used before provision in our state law that said if you're going to have an appropriations before the state Senate, you have to have a quorum there. Now, before I was governor, everything was blue. The governor, both houses of the legislature, both U.S. senators, the congressional delegation. In our 2010 election, we flipped everything. So I had a newly minted Republican majority, brand new members, ready to go to battle. The Senate as well was a little bit different. The Assembly had 25 new members. The Senate had 2 new members. And so when I talked about our reforms, what we were going to do to take on the entrenched establishment, the Assembly, which had the newer members, most from outside of government, were like a scene from Braveheart, the movie. They were ready to put the paint on and go to war. When I told the Senate, so you may be able to relate to this as well, the Senate had what I would call a few more lifers there. And so other than 2 new members, a bunch of the other senators looked at me like I told them their puppy had died. They weren't so certain they wanted to do this, but we did this nonetheless. But in the Senate, 14 Senate Democrats left the state to force or to stop a vote on the reforms that we were pushing. It was only when we eventually split it off and set the appropriation aside that we were able to pass it and move it forward. But it took almost a month to do that. And during that month, all these liberal groups, not just the unions, but every liberal group you can think of from across America started sending people to Wisconsin. In fact, our state capitol at one point there and around the square had 100,000 people in it. I always apologize. The Occupy movement did not start on Wall Street. It started on my street in Madison, Wisconsin. So my apologies if it got passed on around the rest of the country. But in the end, we prevailed. And one of my favorite bumper stickers came from some friends of ours from Wisconsin you might be familiar with, and that is Rachel Campos Duffy, who's on Fox and Friends on the weekend, and great woman, and her husband, Sean, who's on Fox Business News, was a congressman at the time. They gave me a bumper sticker after we had prevailed and the reforms had passed, and the Senate Democrats had to come back. It says, 1 walker beats 14 runners. So, I said, well, how does this all have to do with the work you're doing at Young America's Foundation? And I said, in a real way, it's very much connected. You see, when they sent that many people, not just to protest, I mean, Tonette and I had death threats. Our kids were threatened. They would send death threats about me. They sent a letter once to Tonette saying that I was going to be the first governor in Wisconsin history assassinated. They sent a threat to me that Tonette was going to be gutted like a deer. They targeted our parents and her father. I mean, it just was awful. And they did similar things to our state lawmakers and members of our cabinet. And then eventually, when all else failed, they tried to recall me, right? And we won, as Darlene mentioned, with more votes, more actual votes, not just a higher percentage, more actual votes in a special recall election than we did the first time, which is a good reminder to any of you running for office. If you campaign as a conservative, the best way to get reelected is if you govern like one, because people actually like it, even in the midst of a recall election. But the reason it ties in with so many students across the country is intimidation. You see, what they were doing with us, when they would bring in the banners and the posters and the horns and the gongs and all this stuff, when they issued these threats and did all these things, they were trying to intimidate me and my family. They were trying to intimidate my colleagues in the state legislature because sadly it had worked at the federal, the state, the local level, all across America. These sorts of intimidation factors work. Thankfully, they didn't work in our case, and our reforms now many years later have saved our state and local taxpayers over $16 billion in savings at the local level of schools and money they could put right back into the classroom and now actually reform exceptional teachers. Because one of the other things we did was get rid of collective bargaining so that schools can actually staff based on merit. Imagine that. They can pay based on performance. That means they could put the best and the brightest in the classroom and pay them to be there. And I just ran into a teacher the other day who, they always look around first to see who's near them. And then they kind of whisper, thank you. Because, every school out there aren't many, but the one or two that really should have retired a long time ago. But they're still checking in. And they're gone now, and the good teachers get to be rewarded. Well, we did all those things, and it still works. And I always say the connection for me with our students is on so many of our campuses, they're trying to intimidate the students as well. And so I want to talk about that, but I want to back up for 1 second. Darlene did a fabulous job in the introduction. She made the reference to Ronald Reagan. In fact, Darlene was just with us this last spring, and we had the 25th anniversary of the Reagan Ranch. So in 1998, Nancy Reagan, Mrs. Reagan, turned the keys over to the ranch to Young America's Foundation. And the reason for that was really twofold. One, we started at William F. Buckley's home back in September 11th of all dates, 1960. The home of William F. Buckley in Sharon, Connecticut. That's why our mission statement is called the Sharon Statement. But 2 years later, this former actor from California, really I would argue from the Midwest, named Ronald Reagan, joined our national board. Because even before he was governor, certainly well before he was president, he really believed in conservative values. We were talking about this at the lunch table. But one of the things I love about giving tours at the ranch and talking about, and we're not just about Ronald Reagan, but it's a great connection, is to see, particularly when they bought the ranch in '74 until he was elected in 1980, all the time he spent traveling to and from the ranch and then at the ranch itself, thinking deeply, writing out notes and discussions. You can see it in the book called In His Own Words, talking about why communism had to be defeated, why a threat to free people elsewhere in the world was a threat to us here in the United States, talking about why economically it was much more impactful to improve the economy and the well-being of the American people if more money went back into their hands and not in the hands of the federal government. And so one of the neat things about going to the ranch, well, in 1998, Mrs. Reagan turned the keys over, we took over that, and the cool thing is she left everything there. So you have a personal invitation, Darlene can attest to this, to come out to the Reagan Ranch. It's just outside of Santa Barbara, California. It's phenomenal. A lot of our students have been there. There's a great chapter, YAF chapter at Ave Maria. We've got students all across the country. Not only our chapters, but we help about students on about 2,000 campuses across the nation, in addition to the ones that have our chapters. They come out for conferences in Santa Barbara at the center, and then they go up to the ranch, and they get the tour, and they see everything's there, the hats, the boots, the riding gear, you name it, and you get to see it all. Michael Reagan, who still talks to our students at our conferences, the president's son, or one of his sons, the sane one, Ron Jr. is not so sane. But Michael talks about how he thinks his father could walk right out of the Reagan Ranch. I mean, it's like it's that real. And we use it as a way to emphasize those values, not just to talk about the legacy of Ronald Reagan as a man, but to talk about his ideas. The Presidential Library and Museum is about an hour, a little less than an hour, 50 minutes down the road. We don't run that, we're not associated with that, although a lot of times people go to see both. It's a lot of fun. You got to set up 2 separate days, but it's a great opportunity. So we love being connected to Reagan. You know, the largest tax cut in American history, signed on a table out in front of the ranch. Why I love that is it's such symbolic, such symbolism to him. It's the fact that instead of signing it with a bunch of politicians in front of the White House, he signed it in front of his house with his dog, talking about how it mattered to real life Americans. We can see that, and we'll talk about politics. You think about the difference between the tax cuts we saw, for example, a few years ago under President Trump, and the crazy levels of inflation under Joe Biden. If you don't know the numbers, it's interesting. The typical household in America now is paying $11,500 more per year just to live at the same level, the same quality of life we had in January of 2021 before Donald Trump left office. $11,500. Tonette and I have 2 boys. One of our sons and his wife are trying to buy a new house. They got great credit. They've saved up for years. They're having a tremendously hard time finding it. But for the house they want to buy, you know how much more their mortgage payment is than it was before Joe Biden was in office? $1,500 more a month. A month. So when the talking heads in Washington, when I'm on shows like Meet the Press or that, tell me, well, the economy's getting better because GNP is getting better or because inflation's down. I'm like, go talk to people like my kids who are doing all the right things, who don't have debt, and yet they're paying $1,500 more. The one redeeming thing I talk about, as bad as things are under Joe Biden, I remind them they were pretty bad under Jimmy Carter. The only benefit to Jimmy Carter was ethically he was much, much better. I give the man great ethical credit. I think he was a decent, honorable man who was misguided in his policies. I cannot say the same about Joe Biden. He's a misguided man for sure, but that's just where he's out of the stage and the timing that he's had along the way. But it's just such a contrast. So it's even to our young people, it's a good reminder of what happened, before Ronald Reagan, and then how that kind of a change happened, and what can happen again going forward with the right leadership. And so we love sharing that, not just at the Reagan Ranch or the Reagan Boy at Home, north of Quincy, we were just talking about, in Dixon, Illinois, whether it's conferences out in Virginia or Washington, or even our regional ones. A couple weeks, we'll be just up the way and over in Orlando for one of our Freedom Conferences. So that's the work that we're doing. But let me spend a minute or two telling you why it's important, both long-term and even for this next election. One of the most shocking statistics I've seen in the last month or two has been a national poll that shows that nearly 30% of college students have a fairly positive or positive view of, get this, Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden. Now, this is a complete failure of our education system, particularly when it comes to history and civics, along with the Chinese Communist Party influenced TikTok. Those two things have led to that. Then you add to that, not just that number, but about, so it's 1 out of 5 have a fairly positive viewpoint. 3 out of 10 actually think his ideas are somehow an idea of good, that there's some good to that. And it's all because of this twisted perception of reality of what's going on. You look similarly when it comes to capitalism amongst the survey of college students. Less than a quarter of all the college students actually think capitalism is a good thing. And only half in America actually connect capitalism to free markets. Now, you might be overwhelmed. I said, well, the good part about it is that they just really don't know the connection. Nobody's really told them about how market-based capitalism is far, far superior to government-driven socialism. So I look there and see, as frustrating and agonizing as it is, there's tremendous challenges, but there's also tremendous opportunities. I don't get upset at this generation. I get upset at society, not all of us here in this room, but the rest of us in general, because we failed these kids. When you look at middle school, and less than 13% are proficient in history, and 22% are proficient in civics, and 40% don't even have a basic understanding of history. No wonder they're so out of whack on this stuff. They're just out of their mind. And so that's really, when we look ahead, you say, well, how does that tie into politics? Well, think about the 2018, the 2020, and most recently the 2020 fall elections. Remember how there was supposed to be a big red wave? You all had it here. I would argue my friend Kim Reynolds and those in Florida had it, but largely the rest of the country was a fizzle, right? What was the big factor? The media will say, oh, it's quality of candidates. Quality candidates are a good thing, don't get me wrong, but if it was quality candidates, John Fetterman would not have won the United States Senate race in Pennsylvania. Although I got to tell you, he got hospitalized, and lately he's actually talking a little bit better. So apparently we just need to send more liberals to Walter Reed Hospital, and suddenly they start talking better on things along the way, right? Actually, last year, before he'd gone, was hospitalized and was a little bit more sane on the border in Israel. One of my favorite memes was one that was a caricature, but of the Biden-Harris logo. It said, Biden Fetterman 2024. It's a no-brainer. But Fetterman aside, for all we said, it's the quality of the candidates. It's not. John Fetterman wasn't the quality candidate. And people say, oh, it's an issue here or there, but I can give you plenty of examples of how one issue they talk about alone wasn't the driving factor in most of these races. If you're really looking for the thing that the media has largely ignored, it's 18 of the 29-year-old voters. In Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Nevada, in Arizona, and Georgia, the same states that will elect the next president of the United States, 18 to 29-year-old voters went with the radical leftist candidate by 30 to 40 points or more. 30 to 40 points or more. Conversely, in a handful of other races, including right here in Florida, Rubio's race, that margin with 18 to 29-year-old voters was under 20%. So like it is sometimes in our big cities, we get overwhelmed and say, oh, we got to win. We don't have to win big cities in the same way. We don't have to win 18 to 29-year-olds. We just can't get slaughtered, right? In Florida, in North Carolina, Ohio, each of those candidates for the Senate won by or lost the 18 to 29-year-old vote by less than 20 points, and they won their elections. In the ones where we lost that margin or that vote by 30 to 40 points or more, we lost the elections. It's simple math, right? It's simple math. And so I love the fact that you all are interested in this. I love there's people running for the school board because there's so many things to do. I mean, school board, try to take charge of your schools. If you can't there, if you're a parent, grandparent, help get them to a private school. But when you do that private school, make sure you check the private school out because not every private school, even those that claim to be faith-based, are necessarily ones that aren't completely woke along the way. Homeschool if you can, support others who do along the way. I love the fact that I'm going to reaffirm the pitch that was made for Patriot Readers. Because if you could reach every kid at that age in this county, in this region, in this state, if we could do it across America, it would have a life-changing impact. Because the good news I want to tell you is kids are hungry. They've only heard one side of the issue. I pointed out after the 2022 elections when I said what I just said here that, it's young voters. In Pennsylvania, when they make up 13% of the electorate and we get creamed by 40 points, you can't make that margin up with the rest of the electorate out there. It's young voters. They say, oh, you're trying to get younger voters not to vote. I said, I'm not afraid of young voters. I'm afraid of young voters who've only been exposed to one side of the story. That's what I'm afraid of. So to the extent that we can find every way possible, and I would say, even if you don't do any of those things, every one of you here, if you got kids, more importantly, if you got grandkids, maybe nieces, nephews, particularly those of your grandparents, one personal tip, talk with your grandchildren. Don't talk at your grandchildren. Even some of those that maybe are in college and you think have lost their mind, the last thing you want to do is talk at them. Don't wag that finger. What is wrong with you? What are they teaching you? What's wrong? How insane are you? Because they'll shut that right off. But you talk with them, you'd be amazed how hungry your grandkids are, even those that you think you lost, how hungry they are to hear what you have to say. But talk with them. Talk about why things matter. If you started a business, someone in your family started a business, tell them how tough that was. Tell them how for years you didn't take a salary to make sure the people on your payroll had a salary to take care of their families. Talk about why you love this country. One of the most powerful set of speakers we have at our Young America's Foundation conferences are men and women who've come from communist nations. I was just having breakfast with one of them here today from Naples. She came from Hungary and talked about that at one of our Escaping Communism conferences. We have a great speaker called Yami Park who escaped a defector from North Korea. Horrific story about her and her mother were abused and sexually assaulted and all sorts of things. She comes, finally gets to America, goes to Columbia University. She's a bright young woman. And in the first semester, she couldn't contain herself. She said, what is wrong with you people? Because all they did was talk about how bad America was. She said, come with me to North Korea. She said, they promised equity to my ancestors. And what they got was they gave up their property. They gave up their rights. They gave up their freedoms. And now they're all equally poor and oppressed. What is wrong? Those sorts of speakers in particular are powerful. So if you got stories like that, or you know of people that have come from Cuba, you've come from Venezuela, come from places where not only they can match the logic, but tell it from emotion, our young people are hungry for that. Let me give you two quick stories, and then I'll take a little bit of time for some questions. One is, we do, in addition to these conferences, we do more campus lectures than any other organization out there. I'm proud to be involved with that. We don't just do them for our chapters. We do actually more lectures for college Republican chapters than the National College Republican Committee does. Because we'll pay for it. It's educational. We're a 501c3, so we can't do any campaigning, but we can bring a speaker. We can, like, for example, after the horrific attacks on innocent Israelis back on October 7th, we sent out information to all of our campuses. We sent out details. Ivan Ray is going to have a great speaker coming up on that regard. But we sent Ben Shapiro to the University of Florida about a week after, and he just cleaned up. I mean, he just, put the radicals to shame out there. You got people talking about from the river to the sea who don't even know what sea you're talking about. They don't know what river you're talking about. I'm like, really? It's just unbelievable. But we send more out there. But I want to tell you a quick story about one of the speakers we had at the beginning of the fall semester. So we have them all over the country, and we have young and old and everywhere in between. So one of our favorite speakers of late is someone you're all familiar with, Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, good friend, wonderful guy. So Dr. Carson is speaking at Roanoke College in Western Virginia. And he gives one of his powerful addresses. And all of our speakers, take questions. They interact with the students. It's a lot of fun. So about a few weeks later, I'm reading a story. And sadly, it's like a story we often hear about. It was about a swim team. In this case, it was at Roanoke College, a swim team where the women's team was told a transgender swimmer was going to be forced to be on the team. But this story was different. This story was about Lily, who's the captain of that team, and not all, but a majority of the swimmers on that team having a press conference in which they said, we will not swim if we're forced to have a transgender member on our team because it's just not fair. It's not fair to us. It's not fair to our competition. And that alone, I just love that story. I had the same reaction. I'm like, well, this is awesome. But as I read down at that conference, not only were the girls there, but a bunch of their mothers came. And Lily's mother got up and talked about how proud she was of Lily, being the captain, being the leader on this, and how they were thinking not just of themselves, but someday their future daughters and future generations, and how it had to be fair for them. And then something caught my eye. Hadn't seen it before. Lily's mom said she was inspired after hearing Ben Carson give a speech on courage on her campus. And I thought, I love the statistics of all the lectures that we give. And I said, but that's what it's all about. Just a spark that ignites that flame of courage, in her case within Lily, that then convinced her teammates, that now affected countless other young women across this country who said, we can do that. We don't have to stand for this, because I'm convinced, not only that issue, but so many others, that most young people are more inclined to go with us because our position's more logical. They're just intimidated. And if no one offers a counter, if no one gives them the courage, that spark to tell them, you are on the right side of this issue and someone's going to have your back if you do it, that makes a tremendous difference out there. So one, we were proud of that because we want to make sure that we have more sparks like that all across the country, not just on that, but so many other important issues. One other one you'll particularly find interesting, and then, like I said, I want to have plenty of time to take your questions before we wrap up. And that is, it's about a young man named John. John has graduated now. He works in finance in Houston. But a couple years ago, before I was the president of Young America's Foundation, Ron Robinson, who's a spectacular leader, just set the stage for this phenomenal organization, oversaw us taking over the Reagan Ranch, just a champion in the movement, who lives down here in Naples now. Ron came to me right after I was governor, and he said, would you speak at a couple college campuses? I said, okay, sure. Well, he gives me nice assignments like the Ivy League. I'm at Cornell. And then I end up right before COVID. Last speech I gave before COVID had locked everything down was at Stanford. So, okay, right? Stanford. But I'm used to it. Man, heck, I had 100,000 protesters. Usually I have a couple hundred out in front. I'm like, I actually want to say, really? I had 100,000 protesters. Do you think 500 is going to intimidate me? This is like nothing, but I just take it. But before that event started, like I do at other events, I like to ask people like our chair and others, who are you? Where do you come from? Tell me about yourself. What are you majoring in? What do you want to do? And then I always love to ask when I go give a lecture, how did you become a conservative? And there are three students that organized this. Two of the three were exactly what you'd expect. Great parents, grandparents, good school, all the right genes. So all the things I said to you about the influence you can have reinforced, right? They became conservatives because of their family. The third, named John, says, oh, Governor. He said, no, my parents are raging Democrats. They're liberal through and through. And I said, well, John, how'd you become a conservative? He said, well, one day in high school, I was driving somewhere in my dad's vehicle, and I was about an hour away, and I was bored, and I was by myself, so I turned on the radio. And he said, I didn't know what to listen to, so I started flipping through this channel, right? And he said, suddenly there was this guy on who was magnetic. He was dynamic. He was exciting. Exactly, right? I didn't even need to tell you. You knew what I was talking about. So he said, I listened to this guy, and I just loved listening to him. And then as I listened to him, I'm like, this guy makes sense. He said, so every time I got in the vehicle by myself, not with my parents, he said, I'd scurry to find that station again. He said, I didn't program it because I didn't want my dad to know. He said, but I'd go find that station, And he said, I didn't just listen to him, I'd read the things that Rush Limbaugh would talk about. I'd read the books, and I'd read the articles, and I'd do all these things. And so the good news is, by the time John got to college, he was a full-blooded conservative, but the best kind of all, because he didn't just do it by osmosis. He didn't just do it because some parent dragged him to a rally, all of which is great. I mean, he really thought this through. I mean, I loved it because talking to him, I could tell. I mean, this guy understood that true freedom and prosperity don't come from the clumsy hand of the government. They come from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies through the dignity of hard work. This guy got it. That's a great story. It's a great reminder of the impact we can have. And it's also a great reminder of why the left works so hard on campuses, in schools, on social media, in culture, to cancel our point of view. Why? Because guys like John, all they need to do is hear the truth and they come our way. Now, here's the really punchline. If you doubt for 1 second how valid that is, I want to tell you one more bit of that story. John, after he was in high school and heard Rush, did all this, went to his mother's alma mater, Stanford University, because his mother is none other than Susan Rice. John Rice Cameron is a full-blooded conservative. In fact, since then, I still email John every once in a while. And a year ago on Thanksgiving, you might remember the former chief of staff for Joe Biden put out a tweet that had a list. And it said, going into Thanksgiving, here's a list of things to counter your crazy uncle. He says crazy uncle, he means all of us. You know, your crazy uncle, because there's people who supported President Trump, so he was crazy uncle, and so it was all of us. And it said, here's the list. And amazingly, Susan Rice retweeted that and said, or your son. Which as a parent, I was kind of like, what's your problem, right? But that aside, I emailed John and I said, saw the tweet, happy Thanksgiving, we got your back. And he's still a conservative, he loves his mom, loves his parents, just thinks they're wrong. I tell you that because probably even in this room, there's a few of you who could tell stories of kids or grandkids who went the opposite direction and how frustrating that is. And we get that, we understand it, particularly when they go to college. It's really, really tough. It's why whether it's YAF or college Republicans or something, get them involved. Our youngest went to University of Wisconsin, which is like Berkeley, came out more conservative. That's because he was involved with CRs and both of them were involved in YAF and other things. Get them around people that think like we do, even if it's not us. And you can preserve that. It can make a tremendous difference. Because the number one thing I think you guys would say at conferences we hear from students is more than how cool the speakers are, or even neat it is to go to the ranch, is people who say, I'm not alone. There are other people who think like I do. The whole goal, as it was against me when I was governor, is to intimidate, make you feel like you're out on a limb by yourself. You might experience that even with some friends or neighbors on Facebook or Twitter, social media, or even at gatherings in your whatever area you live in, and that the same thing happens even more so with young people. They just don't have the advantage of years of having been tested. And so whatever you can do, whether it's through YAF, helping young people here, doing your Patriot Readers, running for the school board, all those things are necessary. People ask me all the time if I'm ever going to run again. And I say glibly but accurately, I'm a quarter century younger than Joe Biden. And I am. And about 50 years ahead of where he's at right now mentally. But that's that aside. So someday I might, it's up to God's calling on that one. But I said, I see in my state, and I would argue in other states across the country, what's more important than running for office right now, at least for me, is working to turn the tide with young people. Because if we don't, a state like Wisconsin, which very well may decide who the next president is, will not elect a Republican again. I'm the only Republican elected governor in that state in this century. And so if we want to win in places like that, we have to make inroads with young people. And as red as you are, if you want to keep that, you got to make inroads with young people. So thanks for the chance to share with you. If you got somebody you know, YAF.org, send them our way. And with that, I'd love to take a few questions.
Governor, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it. I want to get your insights. I think the major problem in the United States is the implosion that's going to happen economically. And we just had this fight for the speaker. We've got in Mike Johnson as the speaker. And he's a Republican, a good conservative Republican. What is the problem? Why do they not hear the voice of the American people that we do not want to spend money we don't have? We don't want to support causes that we don't believe in. Our country is literally wide open borders. What is wrong when these people get to Washington and forget what we're asking? I don't know if you have insights, but I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's well, a couple different pieces. That overall, I think you're exactly right. It's part of the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016. I was one of those candidates on the stage next to him. It was me, Jeb Bush, and Donald Trump were the top three at that point. I got out. People often ask, why'd you get out? I said, I got out before I got a nickname, which is pretty smart, right? But no, seriously, I got out because I could see for a while I was peaking because people wanted an outsider. They said, there's the guy who stood up against 100,000 protesters. He took all this on. But they got so frustrated, particularly in 2015, after Republicans took the Senate and still didn't vote to repeal and replace Obamacare, that for a while, not only it was Donald Trump, but Ben Carson and remember Carly Fiorina were peaking above all of us. Because voters in the primary were saying, I want the person with the least political experience. I want the greatest outsider because I'm so fed up with it. And I constantly have to tell reporters all the time who say, how can Donald Trump be ahead in the polls? I'm like, you know, he doesn't always talk or tweet the way I do, but in the Midwest, at least, we value what you do more than what you say. There's a lot of politicians who say all the right things and go to Washington, like you say, and then don't do squat. And so I think there's a lot of voters across America who are very, very worked up about that. What we need is other elected officials to have that kind of courage and to not worry about how long they're going to be in the House or how long they're going to be in the Senate. So that's the larger point. One other quick strategic thing on the spending side, well, two things on that quickly. One is I think we need to talk about spending not in terms of dollars and cents, because 30 trillion, 20 trillion, 40 trillion, to the average American, that's, it's all the same. But when you start talking like I did about my kids, saying they're paying $1,500 more a month because of mortgage rates, because of interest rates out there, that's driven by this massive federal spending. When you talk about the typical household in America paying $11,500 more per year, $900 roughly a month more than they did when Donald Trump was still in office because of all this spending, suddenly people go, I want you to do something about that. We got to stop talking like accountants, no offense to accountants, and talking more like this is a moral issue. This is a moral, not just an economic imperative. The other technical thing I wish they do far before they get to the problems they're in right now lately is change the federal law so the government doesn't get shut down all the time. In Wisconsin and most states, I don't know if Florida has it, but in Wisconsin, if we didn't pass a budget, everything doesn't shut down. It just operates at the base of your budget. Now, spenders don't want that because they want to spend more. But imagine how much better off we were. We said, well, forget about it. Unless you're going to do something above the border, unless you're going to rein in federal spending, we're not going to pass a budget. But it doesn't stop payments to the military. It doesn't shut down national parks. It just keeps spending at the same level as last year. We'd be far better off. But nobody ever talks about that until it's like the 11th hour. And then they got all this nonsense and then they're forced to do it. Once they get past this hurdle, somebody, and I've argued to the speaker and others they should do this, change the law so you don't constantly have a gun to your head to do these stupid things along the way. Anyway.
Governor, I understand according to the Freedom Caucus that a new job may be coming open soon. So have you considered becoming Speaker of the House?
You know, years ago, Mark Levin actually told me in 2011, he did the research for at that time, I think others have talked about it since, you don't actually have to be a member of the House to be the Speaker. Having said that, I don't ever want to be in Congress, under no circumstances. I remember once in New Hampshire, once someone mistakenly, after I was up after Ted Cruz called me a senator, and I said, wait a minute. I'm a governor. I work for a living. Those people in Congress just show up and talk. We actually get things done. So you'd have to put a gun to my head. But God bless the people who are willing to do that. Yeah.
Governor, thank you. Welcome. your Young America's Foundation, I think, might be able to help here. We've got two issues that I'm interested in seeing what you think. We have a Swiftie movement going on, Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
She's got millions of followers. She sent out an email, I don't know if it was on TikTok, it probably was, registering all kinds of, millions of voters have registered as a result of Taylor Swift. TikTok is another issue that has to be dealt with. And I'm wondering, how do we overcome that?
Well, there's hope, and they have tremendous advantages. But, for example, we did a poll at Young America's Foundation before the first presidential primary debate in August. It was interesting. You don't hear this maybe in Newsmax and Fox, but you don't hear this anywhere else. In that poll, nationwide poll, not of our students, but nationwide general population poll of college and high school students, you know what the number one issue was for college students? It was not gay and lesbian rights. It was not even climate change. Number one issue, the economy. Number one issue, the economy. So we got to stop pretending like we got to talk about all these other crazy things, but talk about it not in terms of 401ks, but talk about it in terms of their life, what impact it's having in real terms. I said the big mistake I've said for years at any age is as conservatives, we talk with our head and think with our head. The left talks and thinks with their heart. We need to talk with our head, think with our head, talk with our heart. Greatest teacher I've ever heard of told parables. We should tell more stories along the way about why it's relevant. The other part on that is in that same poll, interestingly enough, it's an issue I referenced a moment ago, but we asked them about fairness. Is it fair for someone to compete in varsity sports if they were biologically born as a man against people who were born biologically as women? 2/3 said it's not fair. 2/3 of college students said not fair. Equally as interesting, we asked, is it right, is it fair to use race as a condition for enrollment in college or even employment? 2/3 said no, it's not fair. And interesting enough, if you separate it out by race, that was even true with Black and Hispanic students. So meritocracy works with college students. It even works with Black and Hispanic college students. And so we got to stop pussyfooting around and pretending like our issues don't resonate. We just got to talk about it in ways that connect with young people. We're never going to have the Taylor Swift megaphone at once, but millions of us sharing that message with the young people, not being afraid to talk to young people, to go to college campuses, to talk to high schoolers, to talk to our kids and grandkids. I think that's the ultimate counter.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then we have some announcements and the drawing. So please stay for one last question.
Thank you. I have one question for you. If we are such a racist country, woke, why are millions of people of color coming into our country? And why don't our smart Harvard, Ivy League school students see this? Thank you.
Yeah. You're right. And again, thankfully, I go back to the factor on this is for all of us, as well as for the students, don't let the radical few determine the narrative. I mean, there are more liberal than conservative students for sure. But in that same poll I referenced before, you know what the plurality was? Top of the list? Moderate. Which, to me, there's hope because if say you're moderate on college campus, that means you're probably conservative. You're just scared to say it out loud, right? You know, you're more with us than not. But so there's hope because they're so overwhelmed. They have such an advantage. They have not only the professors, the student body, TikTok, everything else on their side. And yet there are still young people who are at least kind of leaning our way. So on those issues, we just got to go out and be, again, this is my qualifier though. Don't yell at people about it. Don't wag your finger at people about it. Don't ask them what's wrong with it. Don't tell them this is all a scam. Point out to them, tell those stories about, my goodness, we're the greatest experiment in the history of the world. You know, I always think of it, one of the things I tell kids when I'm talking about this very topic is, you can relate to this, it's a little bit further south, but I can still remember as a kid watching people float over from Cuba on inner tubes where there were so many on, they were about halfway in the water over shark-infested waters. I said, why would somebody do that? Freedom. They aren't going the other way. When we talk about that, we have a slab of the Berlin Wall right when you walk in the Reagan Ranch Center. And I love it when liberals get all worked up. Oh, you were for tearing the wall down. Why do you want to put a wall up? 2 different walls. That's to keep people out who want to do us harm. The other wall was to keep people from leaving who wanted freedom, right? In fact, they inadvertently make our point. We said, why did they have to put a wall up literally in the middle of the night? A 12-foot wall went up. Why? Because too many people were trying to go from East Berlin to West Berlin because they wanted freedom. When you saw, remember a couple months back, there were these drones going up and down in front of the backside of apartment complexes in China when the lockdowns were going on, not the 2020 ones, the more recent ones. And they actually said, if you interpret, you translate, they said, resist your temptation for freedom. Stay inside your apartment. It is inherent in our human being. It's why our rights declared in our Declaration of Independence are not rights from the government. They're from God. God knows in our being we want to be free. But the key is, I think with all of this, is don't be intimidated. Don't be afraid. Speak the truth, not with our wagging finger, but with passion, with love, with compassion. We're not angry at this generation. We love them so much, we owe it to them. They deserve to know the truth. And if they do, the truth will only be good for us. It'll be good for them and future generations as we preserve this beloved republic. God bless you.